A professor from the Faculty of Medicine gives a lecture about insomnia. She explains that if someone doesn't sleep for just 1 or 2 nights, it already affects their physical and mental condition, making them emotional and even causing hallucinations. So what would happen if someone doesn't sleep for a much longer period, like months or years? Just imagine how severe the side effects would be. At that campus, the professor has the smartest student named Jane. Jane once told the professor that she often has trouble sleeping and stays up late. The longest she ever stayed awake was 3 nights. She also once told a story that when she was 9 years old, both of her parents died in an accident. After that, she and her younger sister June moved to their grandmother's house. Since living there, Jane has felt insecure about the safety of the house. That's why she checks the locks every night. Even though she knows she already locked all the doors, she still feels uneasy unless she checks again. It gives her peace of mind. She says she already uses her time well when she can't sleep, like staying up to study until dawn and going to the market early in the morning to buy groceries. One day, when she is about to leave for campus, Jane receives a letter notifying her about an overdue house loan payment. The amount she has to pay is around 728,155 baht. Not long after, June arrives home from school. Lately, she often comes home late, or even the next day, just like today. Since her relationship with her sister isn't very close, June doesn't want to explain why she always comes home late. Because she doesn't have the money to pay off the house loan, Jane tells the professor that she has decided to drop out of college and wants to find a job to earn some money. Understanding her student's situation, the professor suggests working as a lab assistant, but Jane isn't interested in that job because the pay doesn't meet her expectations. That reminds the professor of a pharmaceutical company from Germany that once contacted her, saying they were looking for volunteers for a new drug trial and the pay is high. Jane becomes interested. She then goes to the company's facility, where she meets the research director named Mr. Hans. Mr. Hans explains the mission Jane will undertake, which is to produce a substance called creatinine, which comes from a part of the brain. Creatinine can be used to treat brain-dead patients, and this substance can only be produced when a person is still awake and not asleep. The company calls this experiment DEEP, which consists of 3 levels. The higher the level, the more concentrated the creatinine becomes, and the duration of each level may vary from person to person. After Jane learns about her mission, she asks how much money she will receive. Mr. Hans replies that for level 1, the reward is 100,000 baht. Feeling that the amount is quite attractive, Jane signs the agreement, and the experiment begins with an injection into the back of her neck. In that injection, there is a chip implanted into her neck, allowing the creatinine from her brain to be extracted by the chip. Mr. Hans then tells her that as long as the chip remains implanted in her neck, she must wear a special black watch that will monitor her heart rate and measure how much creatinine has been collected in percentage. Once it reaches 100%, Jane is instructed to return to the facility so they can remove the chip. Mr. Hans reminds her that she has signed the agreement, especially the part that states this experiment is confidential. Therefore, she is not allowed to tell anyone, as the company doesn't want their competitors to hear about what they're doing. One more thing before leaving the room, Jane must not fall asleep at all. If she sleeps for more than 60 seconds, the chip might short-circuit, and she could die from a heart attack caused by the short circuit. But Mr. Hans says not to worry if she accidentally falls asleep because the black watch will alert her with a 60-second countdown, so she will still be safe. The DEEP Level 1 experiment begins on the first day. After placing the company's business card in a drawer, Jane stays up late as usual due to her routine. After checking on her grandmother who is still fine, she hears a car outside the house. It turns out to be June, who just arrived home from school with a guy. Jane asks who the guy is, and June replies that he is just a ride-hailing driver. But Jane isn't satisfied and wants to know why June always comes home late. June gives the excuse that she practices with her band as a guitarist. Jane doesn't believe her, so she insists on knowing the truth until she accidentally breaks June's phone that drops on the ground, making her even more furious. On the second day, while eating in the canteen, a guy suddenly sits near Jane. His name is Win, and he recognizes that Jane is part of the DEEP experiment because of the black watch she wears. Win is her classmate who enjoys partying at night and drinking, which makes it hard for him to sleep. This is also why he joins the DEEP experiment, thanks to the professor's recommendation. But Win says that they're not the only ones who suffer from professional insomnia. There are others in the experiment, including a girl named Chin, a campus influencer who loves Korean beauty care products. Although Chin has great grades, school gives her so much stress that she can hardly sleep. That's why she always relies on sleeping pills. It's not just Chin. There's also a guy named Peach, a bookworm and online game addict who has many online friends. When he's not studying, he logs into his favorite games, especially PUBG.
Game,แล้วก็เกม
After learning that Jane just signed up for the deep experiment yesterday, Chin and the others reveal that they also just joined the experiment yesterday. But they say they wouldn't have done it if not for the 100,000 baht payment. However, Peach reminds them that if they fail, they could lose their lives if they fall asleep. Still, Jane feels confident that they can complete the mission after seeing how good her friends are at staying up late. After exchanging contacts and following each other on Instagram, Jane and her new friends return to their own activities. Once their creatinine percentage reaches 100%, they all receive the 100,000 baht payment as promised. With that big money, they buy things they like. Win buys a cool watch, Chin goes to a facial treatment clinic, and Peach gets a mobile gaming setup. Meanwhile, Jane uses the money to pay off part of her house debt. Win also buys a fancy sport bike, but it turns out he is just imagining it while riding someone else's motorbike, and he ends up grinning to himself. After buying a massage tool for her grandmother, Jane sees an iPhone that catches her interest. Since she had already broken June's phone, Jane decided to buy the iPhone as a gift for her sister. After their dreams come true with the 100,000 baht, Jane and her friends gather at a bowling alley, where Chin reveals that ever since she joined Deep, she feels like someone has been stalking her from a distance. She claims she already checked her surroundings, but no one is there, which makes Win think it might be a psychopath. Jane then asks her friends if they want to join the Deep experiment again, this time in level 2. They all say yes, because the most important thing is earning more money. This makes Chin think about creating a group chat, so she asks what name would suit the group. Jane suggests the name Deep Process Research Group, but her friends say it sounds like a thesis paper. Chin then proposes the name Sleepless Gang, but it doesn't sound cool enough. Not long after that, Peach comes up with the name Non Non, but the others don't know what it means. So Peach explains that the first Non means no, while the second Non is Thai for sleep. So Non Non means no sleep.
อ๋อนอน เครียดมากนอน
Thinking it sounds cool, the group agrees to use that name, and finally, the Non Non group toasts with the hope of getting rich soon. Sometime after having fun, the group decides to go home, and just before Chin parts ways with the boys, Win notices that Peach has a crush on Chin. That's why Win encourages Peach to walk home with her, so he can get closer to her. Seeing Peach keeping his distance, Chin assures him that she doesn't have the trending virus going around recently. So Peach tries not to look awkward in front of her, even claiming he feels worried after learning someone has been stalking her. Meanwhile, Jane gives her new iPhone to June, which makes her very happy, but also curious about where Jane gets the money. Jane claims it comes from her part-time job, though she doesn't explain what kind of job it is, which confuses June. But what matters to her is that she gets a new phone, and even better, the time finally comes for Jane and her friends to begin Deep Level 2, where this level lasts longer than Level 1, and the creatinine needed is much greater than before. Jane asks how many days it will take for the creatinine to reach 100%. Mr. Han says it varies for each person, but based on their previous performance, he estimates it will take about 5 days. Jane and the others feel that 5 days is already a long time, but Jane asks how much money they will earn. Mr. Hans answers, around 500,000 baht. Before anything even starts, they already fantasize about the dreams that will come true in 5 days. Jane paying off her remaining 70 million debt, when finally getting his dream sport bike for weekend rides. Chin being able to afford next-level beauty treatments, and Peach finally having the courage to propose to Chin. But as they reach the 3rd day in Deep Level 2, the creatinine they produce hasn't even reached halfway, which causes Jane and her friends to feel off, especially their blurry vision and short temper. By the 4th day, they begin experiencing hallucinations, especially Jane, who imagines that the corpse she's dissecting during a real cadaver practice is actually. As a result, Jane and her friends start complaining about how hard level 2 is and fear that they might fall into a deep sleep. But after seeing the creatinine numbers among them, Jane notices Wynn's percentage is higher than the others. So she asks what activities Wynn usually does, and he says he likes to work out. Jane suspects that because of Wynn's body movements, he can stay more awake, which helps his creatinine increase faster than the others who rarely exercise. This sparks an idea in Wynn's mind, something brilliant. And finally, they all stop falling asleep so easily. While relaxing, Wynn expresses his desire to know more about Jane's life, and when he asks about her parents, Jane recalls a traumatic incident in her family. There was a murder reported at her house when she was still a child, and it turns out both of her parents were killed by a murderer. But Jane chooses not to tell Wynn about that dark past. To help them stay awake even longer, Wynn claims to have another cool idea: mixing a stimulant pill with a special drink often found in bars. At first, Jane thinks the drink might be dangerous, but after Wynn drinks it and turns out fine, Jane and her friends also get interested in trying the magic drink. And in the end, they all join in. As a result, they get buzzed, but that buzz helps them produce even more creatinine, until Jane unconsciously finds herself near Wynn, and finally, Jane. Sometime later, while Chin is in the bathroom, she feels something strange happening to her body, but she doesn't pay much attention to it. However, after coming out, she hears something off, her own voice coming from Peach's room. So Chin goes there, and it turns out Peach has been watching her all along during her live social media streams. Not only that, there are many photos of her hanging on Peach's wall, meaning he has been stalking her everywhere with a hidden camera. As a result, Chin screams and passes out, causing the others to rush into the room and notice that Chin's countdown timer on her black watch has started. Knowing there's no time to argue with Peach, Jane and the others try to save Chin using CPR, because if her countdown reaches 0, she could suffer a heart attack that might kill her. So Jane and her friends keep trying CPR, and just before the countdown hits 0, they finally manage to save her. Even though Jane and her friends successfully collect 100% creatinine, they decide not to participate in the deep experiment again. But Mr. Hans tells them that the prize for deep level 3 is 800,000 baht. Even so, Jane and the others still refuse to join level 3 and decide to return to their normal lives. The next day, Peach tries to explain to Chin why he has been stalking her, because he really likes her. But since Chin is already furious about what Peach did, she refuses to be close to him again, even though he asks if they can just stay friends. Jane also faces bad news. Her grades drop drastically because of the deep experiment, which ruins her mood. So when Wynn invites her to an Ed Sheeran concert, she turns him down and realizes that Wynn might be trying to get close to her. That's why she is honest with him, saying she only sees him as a friend, and that she doesn't have time for romance because she has to focus on studying and taking care of her grandmother and sister. As a result, Wynn feels heartbroken and disappointed. One day, when Jane gets another bout of insecurity about the safety of their house, she checks on her grandmother, as usual, by calling her name. But after calling her several times with no response, Jane finds out that her grandmother suffers a stroke, so she has to be taken to the hospital for surgery. But because there is not enough money to pay for the surgery, she wants to look for another hospital with a cheaper cost. However, June admits that she already has money to pay for half of it, which turns out to be the result of her participation in Deep Experiment Level 1 and Level 2. This, of course, shocks Jane, since June had once seen the business card from the pharmaceutical company Jane held earlier, and from there, June becomes interested in joining Deep 2. As a result, Jane gets angry because June doesn't tell her beforehand, and the sisters end up fighting. After returning home, Jane wants to check on June in her room, but she is not there, and Jane suspects that she has already gone to the pharmaceutical company. So she forces her way into Mr. Han's experiment room, and it turns out June has already been implanted with a chip to undergo Deep Level 3. Jane demands that Mr. Hans remove June's chip, or else she threatens to report him to the police. But he says he does nothing wrong, since June herself wants to join the experiment. However, Mr. Hans agrees to remove June's chip if Jane and her friends successfully complete Deep Level 3, which makes Jane feel threatened. In the end, she leaves with June. Jane then asks her friends for help to do Deep Level 3, and Win agrees. But Chin and Peach refuse because they are afraid they might die, so they leave. But when they get home, both Chin and Peach feel down without their friends, especially Chin, who feels indebted to Jane for saving her before. So when Jane, Win, and June go to meet Mr. Hans, Chin and Peach show up and decide to help Jane, and finally, everyone becomes motivated. Finally, the time for Deep Level 3 comes. Jane says she has asked for help from someone she could trust, her female professor. In an old ward owned by the professor's father, she tells them that she will inject them with a special liquid daily to keep them awake. In addition, Jane and her friends can use the room-to-room intercom near the door to communicate with her. Jane feels grateful to the professor, but the professor admits she feels guilty for giving Jane the info about the pharmaceutical company. That's why she wants to help them as a form of responsibility. After the professor goes back to campus, Jane and her friends start doing all kinds of activities in the ward until, by day 6, they begin to experience hallucinations one by one. Peach feels as if he is being called to do unthinkable things. Chin gets overwhelmed with acne when sees visions of his dead mother, and Jane sees June having seizures. Luckily, after some time, most of them manage to snap out of their hallucinations, except for Chin, who cannot handle what she sees. She smashes a mirror, and her face ends up injured by the shards. As a result, Chin becomes furious with the situation and gets emotional when the others try to calm her down. She blames everything on June. Chin even says that Win only joins this mission to win Jane's heart, which offends him. Win becomes emotional too, and when Peach tries to calm him down, Win insults him by calling him weak. This makes Peach angry, and they end up fighting. Jane sees that no one else knows what to do, so she tries to contact the professor through the intercom, but gets no response. So Jane goes to look for her and finds a room with its door open. She assumes the professor is there. But what Jane finds is shocking. The professor is actually part of the Deep experiment. There are documents about Mr. Han's pharmaceutical company, but it turns out Mr. Hans is not the real boss. The professor is. There's even a document that reveals Mr. Hans is just pretending to be a foreign doctor named Hans, while his real name is Jim. Not long after, the professor shows up and surprises Jane, triggering a memory of an interview she once had with her. It turns out the professor had been interviewing all the students to find those suitable for the Deep experiment. When she found out Jane was one of them, she smiled. Jane immediately runs back to the ward and tells her friends that the professor is the mastermind behind everything. They decide to call the police. But it turns out the professor already disables their phone signal and internet and locks the door. So Jane and her friends become trapped. However, the professor promises to release them if she gets a chip with 100% creatinine, or if one of them dies. By the 7th day, the group's condition worsens. Chin becomes more aggressive and destroys all the CCTV cameras in the ward. Win can no longer endure the pain and ends up collapsing, while his countdown to a heart attack starts. He remembers the strained relationship he had with his father after his mother passed away due to a tragic incident. It turns out the incident was his mother taking her own life. This makes Win lose the will to live, and finally, he dies from the heart attack. Not wanting the police to find out, the professor quickly takes Win's body to her private room, where she removes the chip from his neck. But suddenly, Win turns out to be alive just before the others arrive and reveal how they faked his death. It turns out Jane and the others had found a drug in the ward called CCL, which could temporarily cause a heart attack. After finding it, Chin purposely destroys all the CCTVs to create panic in the professor's eyes. That way, she can't see that Win volunteers to use the CCL drug, giving him the chance to attack the professor when she lets her guard down. Now, Jane and her friends want to know why the professor created the Deep experiment in the first place. So she reveals someone to them, her true love from college. She explains that her boyfriend once used himself as a subject for an experiment, and because of his extreme ambition, he ended up severely sleep-deprived and began hallucinating. During one of his hallucinations, he unconsciously walked to the rooftop and did something unthinkable. As a result, he fell into a coma. So the professor researched how to wake him up until she found one possible way, by extracting creatinine from the brains of sleep-deprived people. The treatment using creatinine showed positive results. Her boyfriend even moved his hand. But the creatinine from one person was not enough, which is why she needed more. But the friends see how the professor puts lives in danger for her own gain, especially Jane, who once saw someone die because of the deep experiment. The professor responds by saying the method should be safe, as long as the person follows the instructions given. Even though the friends say what the professor does is wrong, she insists that she only wants to wake up the man she loves, and claims that Jane and the others don't understand how painful it is to lose someone you love. In the end, Jane and the others decide to call the police, which the professor cannot accept, so she stops them by injecting Jane with a sedative. As a result, Jane passes out and her heart attack countdown starts. The friends immediately try to revive her using CPR, while the others hold back the professor's attacks. But after a while, the CPR doesn't work well enough, so they use a special device to deliver an electric shock in order to wake Jane up. However, even after using the device, Jane still doesn't wake up, and the countdown timer reaches 0 until finally, she dies. All the friends cannot believe that Jane has passed away, but June refuses to accept this fate and keeps pounding on her sister's chest, and finally, Jane comes back to life. After the incident, the professor is reported to have been arrested by the police. Jane and her friends don't receive any money from completing Deep Level 3, but they feel the most important thing is that the chips are no longer on their necks. Sometime later, Jane and her friends return to living their normal lives, especially June, who no longer fights with her sister. Their grandmother is also discharged from the hospital in good health. In addition, Jane and her friends are finally able to sleep soundly again, no longer struggling with insomnia, realizing that proper sleep is truly important for their bodies. The movie ends with Jane and her friends going camping outside, and finally, the Non group can have fun together again, just like before. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notification so you don't miss the latest recaps. Thanks for watching and wish you good health.